Amen. Thank you, Father. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming out for the lecture today. The theme will be philosophy, faith, and art. And this fresco here will be the theme for the next 3 lectures. And we'll talk about this a little later. Okay, so in the next 3 lectures, we'll be looking at how philosophy has informed the church teachings down through history, and then how that plays out in art. We'll look at art as a means of communications and how we communicate our faith through art. Throughout history, religion has been, throughout history, religious art has been known as the poor man's Bible. It was the preferred instrument in teaching illiterate people in the pre-modern era. Children still learn by art. Art is more informative, is more than informative. There's a devotional aspect to it, and art can inspire us as it reveals the mystery of our faith. Okay. The early church, and a very influential church father by the name of Tertullian, once said, "What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem?" Now, Athens is a metaphor for philosophy, and Jerusalem is a metaphor for religion. So that could be rephrased into, what does philosophy have to do with religion? If you were to ask St. Augustine, he would say everything. Well, almost everything, anyway, because philosophy is not religion. But philosophy has its basis in knowledge acquired from rational and logical thought. So if there is a God, we should be able to know of him rationally and logically before we know him through revelation. Even the Catechism of the Catholic Church has something to say about this. Okay. If you check, and you can make a note of that, and those references, paragraph 36 in the Catechism says, God, the first principle and the last end of all things, can be known with certainty from the created world by the light, by the natural light of human reason. If you refer to paragraph 159 of the Catechism, it says there can never be any real discrepancy between faith and reason. God cannot deny himself, nor can truth ever contradict truth. Now, the great philosophers Plato and Aristotle, who were the focal point of that painting we looked at in the introduction, and we'll go back to that in just a moment, right? Both comprehended, right, that and believed in a creator who we call God, without the benefit of revelation. Right? So logic tells us there is a God. Revelation tells us who he is. That's what is meant by going from Athens to Jerusalem. We call this the intersection of philosophy and theology, going from reason to revelation. All right, we'll begin today's study at roughly about 400 AD in North Africa, in the city of Hippo, which is in modern-day Algeria, and the life of its bishop, St. Augustine. Augustine, the bishop of Hippo, was the most prolific writer in the early church, and one of the most influential. His writings informed Christian society up to and through the Middle Ages. Augustine remains to this day one of the most influential fathers in the church. As a matter of fact, he is the most cited authority in the Catechism of the Catholic Church outside of Scriptures. He's cited almost 90 times, so his influence is enormous. His writings alone exceed those of the authors from antiquity, Christian and pagan writers. He's the most prolific writer. Okay. Two of his most influential works are his Confessions and The City of God. In Latin, it was written in Latin, and it's De Civitas Dei. We will look at that work, The City of God. As a young man, Augustine He thought the Bible was full of fairy tales. So he was turned off by Christianity. But at 17, he was sent to Carthage. Carthage is in North Africa on the Mediterranean coast, for a classical education. And there he discovered Manichaeism. Manichaeism was a religion, actually, and it was a heresy in the early church. So Manichaeism, for a time, satisfied this young man's hunger for truth. Manichaeism is a dualist religion that believed in the forces of good and evil. It was a combination of Christic, Gnostic, and pagan beliefs. For Augustine, though, it explained the existence of evil in the world. So Augustine came to his religious beliefs through the rational, right? He used philosophy. He was looking for something that could withstand rational analysis, and that is philosophical scrutiny. He rejected the Christianity of his mother. By the way, his mother was Saint Monica. And he rejected his mother's religion because at the time in his life, Christianity could not answer life's pressing questions, one of which, well, for him that was, right? One of which was, why is there evil in the world if God is good? And that's a question that's still asked to this day. Right. Okay. The Manichaeans believed in a good God and an evil God. That would explain the existence of evil, if there is an evil God, right? They believed in light and darkness. All this was known as dualism, right? The spiritual world was good, the material world was evil. Manichaeism fit very nicely into Neoplatonic thought of the day. These teachings were consistent also with Plato's metaphysics. The spiritual world is all good and the material world is imperfect and corrupt. In his philosophical inquiries, Augustine found the writings of the Neoplatonist Plotinus. Let me just make an aside here. Plato was roughly between 300 and 400 BC. Plotinus was 300 AD. There's a 600-year difference between them. Plotinus, called a Neoplatonist, what he did was, 600 years later, he revised Plato's philosophy and expanded on it. That's the difference between Platonism and Neoplatonism. But the core of Neoplatonism is Plato's metaphysics. So sometimes we use the terms interchangeably, and it might be confusing to some people. But that's the difference, right? Neoplatonism was Plotinus came along and expanded on it and actually made it into a type of religion. And by the way, Neoplatonism became the foundation and the basis for most of those Gnostic religions, which they call religions of dualism, good for a good God and an evil God. All right, let's look at it in a little more philosophical way. Thus, the existence of a perfect but non-material metaphysical world, right? And this is what Plato's view of the universe was. There's this perfect world. It's made up of perfect ideas or perfect ideals. The words are related. When we get the word from idealism, there's a perfection out there in a metaphysical, that is a non-material world. And ideals and forms, he called it. And there's a counterpart material world, which is imperfect and corruptible. The material world is the imperfect representation of this perfect metaphysical world. And it included a transcendent one, as he called it, or the cause of creator of all things. He called it the Logos. That's a familiar term to a lot of us, right? It means word, and it's used right in John's Gospel, chapter 1, verses 1. In the beginning was the Word. In the beginning was the Logos. And the Logos was with God, and the Logos is God. So here's perhaps this philosophy, right, by the time of Augustine, had been adopted by Christianity, knowingly or not. There was great influence in Greek philosophy in Palestine, going back 300 years before Christ. We're not going to get into that right now. But the influence and the possibilities that John, for example, and St. Paul were well aware of Platonic philosophy, and it had some influence on early Christianity. So the Platonic and the Neoplaton worldview was a rational explanation of the creation, the creator, and on the other hand, the corruptible world. Now, Augustine was trained in Roman classics and Latin language. He spent several years teaching rhetoric and studying philosophy in Milan. While he was in Milan, he came under the influence of St. Ambrose. Ambrose was the bishop of Milan. And listening to Ambrose's sermons unlocked the meanings of the scriptures for Augustine. Okay? Because of Ambrose, Augustine began to understand the meaning and the Christological typologies that were prevalent in the Old Testament. Now, Christological typologies simply means in the Old Testaments we can see types that foretell Christ. And we hear that when you hear a sermon on the Old Testament, we see Christ in it. We can go into a lot of typologies, but that would be for another session. Okay, so those fairy tales, as he thought the Old Testament was, really held truths that weren't so obvious. Right? Christianity was also compatible with Platonic logic. So Augustine accepted Christianity, was baptized. After his mother's death, he returned to North Africa. By the way, North Africa was a Roman province. It was a very prosperous province. It was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. That's where most of their wheat was grown, and most of it was shipped up to the Roman Empire. So Augustine then came back to Africa, and he formed a small circle of close friends that shared his interest in philosophy and Christian living. Right? They lived according to a common rule, which he wrote, which would become then the Augustinian order that we know today. Okay? He moved to Hippo, and on the death of the bishop there, the people proclaimed him their new bishop. He was an extraordinary bishop, but he did find he found time to be a prolific writer. In the year 410, the Visigoths, which was a Germanic barbarian tribe, had already been over in the Roman Empire for some time. But in 410, they sacked and pillaged Rome. Right? It was not the first time Rome was sacked, but it was the most significant one. It was brutal, and it spelled the end of the Roman Empire in the West. Many wealthy and influential Romans who survived the killings and pillaging then fled to North Africa. Among those refugees, and most of them were pagans, they were Christians also, there was a strong outcry that the sacking of Rome was because the pagan gods had abandoned the city due to the new Christian faith that was playing a more important role in Roman life. They claimed that Rome was always protected by the Roman gods, but the Christian God couldn't protect Rome and the Roman way of life. So Augustine, who was well versed in classical Roman literature and Roman history, came to the defense of the faith with his Opus Magnus, right? His great work, The City of God. It was a work that would set the standard for Western civilization culturally, politically, socially, and religiously throughout the Middle Ages. All medieval institutions were built on the foundations of Christians' teachings, right? And the morality stemming from Augustine's writings, especially from his City of God. Yeah. Oh. Thank you. Okay, the work was a philosophy of history. In other words, it was the first work in history that we know of that actually said that history has a reason, okay, a divine reason. We'll see that now. It explained the failings, that is, the imperfections and the corruptibility of the earthly kingdom on one hand, and on the other hand, the divine kingdom, the heavenly kingdom, which was represented by the church. Here in a worldly way, we have the dichotomy of the two opposing cities, the city of death and the city of life. The city of death would be those great empires, the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, the Greek, the Hellenistic Empire, etc. So the Platonic dichotomy, right, good and bad, right, illustrated by the earthly and the divine. In his work, The Practices of Christian Religion, its values, and its harmonious way of life brings humanity to its end. That's what his philosophy of history is. but it also informs us of God's actions in the world from the very beginning. We call it today, in retrospect, salvation history. Salvation history, sometimes we think of in the Old and New Testament coming down. But salvation history includes history outside. The Greek conquest, for example, of Palestine brought Greek culture, Greek language. It's not for no reason that the three of the Gospels were written in Greek. The Acts of the Apostles written in Greek, right? There was a heavy Greek influence. So that salvation history was all history, even outside of the Old and New Testaments. And looking back on the Middle Ages, though, we can see how this informed life in those days through some artworks. We're going to look at some artworks now. Now, this here is not itself, this is a photograph of an artwork, but this will set us up to look at this particular fresco. This is in the Palazzo Pubblico, or the public palace in Siena. It's roughly 700 years old. At that time, Siena was a city-state. Most of the cities, Florence, Siena, Venice, Genoa, were all city-states in those days. And the fresco encompasses 3 walls. We only have 2 here, right? The wall in the front, the right wall, the wall on the left, and the wall behind us was windows. So it encompasses 3 walls in this hall. You can see how large the hall is by looking at these the doorways here. For man to say 2/3 up, that's pretty large fresco. It's called the Allegory of Good and Bad Government. The artist is Ambrosio Lorenzetti, and this was finished in 1338, right in the Middle Ages. As a matter of fact, it's about 20 years after the Divine Comedy. And the Divine Comedy, if you're familiar with it, is probably the quintessential work on medieval life. It encompasses all medieval life. So this painting is right from the medieval days. That life that was informed by Augustine's City of God. We're going to look at the painting. This is the main fresco on the front wall, of the wall we had across from the windows. And this is the allegory of good government. You see, we have a dichotomy here, right? Keep in mind that Platonic ideal of the perfect metaphysical world and the corruptible earthly world, and and Augustine's City of God, right? The evil cities of the pagans, and then the Christian city by the church. And considering that the church is on earth, it's not in the other world, but the foundations of the church are in the other world, right? And its manifestation, the church militant, is right here with us today. This painting, here's what it gives us. This here, you see, this is the modern doors here, but this boarded up door was the actual entrance into this palace where the ruling committee of 9 would sit. It's called the Hall of the 9. Okay. And over the entranceway, we have the personifications. You know, they always say personifications are larger than life. That's why these characters here, personifications, are much larger than the people here. This is the personification of justice. Good government is ruled by justice. But above her is the personification of wisdom. If you read up on biblical wisdom, you'll see that justice flows or is informed from wisdom. Okay? So wisdom is there, and she's holding the scale. And here's the 2 balances on the scale. This one is a rendition of an angel who's giving out gifts. And if you could see this closer, this is an angel who's got the sword beheading somebody. 2 ends of justice there. There's a cord that you really can't see in this one, but if you do look at this online, you'll see it. A cord running from wisdom through justice down to this personification, Concordia, which means harmony. And the cord runs through, there's 24 characters they're calling the magistrates. And you can see that cord, if not in this one, but if you are up close, runs through the magistrates. That's the court of harmony, of concordance, and it flows up to this large personification of the city or the commune of Siena. That's the colors of Siena, is white and black. Now it goes right up into him, and he sits under the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity in the center. And sitting on both sides are the cardinal virtues with some some added virtues here. This is peace. And you notice the personification of peace. She is relaxing, reclining there. And under her, you can't make it out, but there's a suit of armor rusting. And then we have here fortitude, prudence. We have magnanimity, temperance, and justice again. Interestingly, justice kind of frames the portrait. So this here is good government. Okay. This here is the personification of evil government. And we can, I will describe this in a second. I just wanted to point it out. This was on the left wall in the photograph, so you didn't get to see that. Okay. We'll come back to that. Okay. On the right wall were the effects of good government. You see, here's the town square. You have people dancing in the streets. You have shops. This is a hosiery shop and a shoe shop here. This is a classroom. So you got learning going on, education, people in the street, people doing commerce, people working here on the tops of the building. So you have a prosperous, a happy, right, and a peaceful life, and a progressive one. Here's a close-up of the people dancing and the people in the shops. I believe this is a wine shop, and this is the hosiery and shoe shop here. Okay. I got this scene here, which is an overlay, but you can see more clearly the masons up there laying bricks and expanding on the city. Okay. And this is in the fields. The fields give 2 seasons on a close-up, and it has spring and fall, so it has planting and harvesting. And you see people coming to and from the field working. So it's, again, prosperity. Okay, next one. Now here's, which was on the left wall, the allegory of bad government. And we have, this is the allegory of bad government, and he's sitting under, well, let's see, I don't have my cue sheet, but we have cruelty, treason, and fraud. We have divisiveness and war. This is a fury. And this here would be pride, vainglory, and, okay, I don't remember this one, I'm sorry. But you see this person bound here, that's justice. Okay. All right. By the way, there's a lot of damage to that side. And they said the damage is done. We can do questions after, okay. The damage is that they believe in the medieval time that people actually would be throwing things at this painting, the allegory of bad government. But you can see, for example, a person here dead in the streets. This is a woman being taken into captivity. This is a soldier. We can only guess at what they're doing here, but there's the ongoing story here of an evil government, the city deteriorating. You see big holes in the walls, no one in the streets. Okay. And then you see the damage here, probably from warfare, shooting the catapults, those big stones into buildings, and the streets are empty. Okay. And this is the fields. The fields are burned. There's houses here on fire. There's only about 2 people. They're probably soldiers. It's deserted. The fields are unfruitful. So that gives us the analogy. This is the kind of influence, this kind of thing that corresponds, say, to Dante's Divine Comedy. It shows the realism. It's all influential because medieval times, according to the influence of Augustine, gave us a theocentric society. Everything's surrounded around religion in the towns. Life went on according to the church liturgy. Okay. I make this contrast because next week, right, we're going to be talking about a big change in the philosophical outlook, the theological outlook that it influences, and then the artwork that will flow from it. Okay. Now, I just wanted to remind you of the allegory of good government. He looks familiar, doesn't he? Some of us, okay. Next one. All right, now, I want to look at that Platonic ideal of perfection. And I'm going to introduce another art form, and that is perfection in the art, the icon. The closest any art form comes to the Platonic ideal of perfection and otherworldliness is the icon. Now, outside the Roman rites in the Eastern rites in the Catholic Church or the Orthodox churches, little is known about icons in the West. All right, so here is the tradition. How many of you are familiar with the iconic tradition? Okay, all right, some don't. So let's go through it though. The Greek word icon means image. It is the same word used in the Old Testament in Genesis, referring to man as made in the image or in the icon of God, icon being image. And I want to point that out for a minute because God is a pure spirit here, right? He's not Jesus. So what is that image? The image, right, is not a material or physical image, right? That the church teaches that man is made in the image of God through intellect and free will. So, okay. Now the very first icons of Jesus and the Blessed Mother, according to tradition, were not made by hand or without hands. And you see that quote when you look and you study up on icons. But were produced miraculously, but we'll explain that. Okay, next one. Okay. All right, now no image was allowed of God, the second commandment, right? Because he was a pure spirit and had no physical or material image. But Christ became flesh and took on an earthly life. So the icons of Christ bear witness to the incarnation, to Christ's humanity. Icons are not painted. They're written. Now, don't take me literally on this. Let's get the concept here. All right. We know somebody is dabbing paint and painting, but the tradition is they're written. Okay? This explains the use of the terms iconography, which simply means written image, and iconographer, the ones who produce them, right, is one who writes the image. And these terms go back to antiquity. Right? So the goal, in other words, is not to copy the exact and the real image of the person, right? But it's to capture the very essence of that person on a metaphysical level, the spiritual level. See, in the same sense, the most perfect of arts, it is the most perfect of arts because it is not imitative. Now, we'll see next week, Renaissance art and art today, and a lot of, well, not modern art, but art throughout the Renaissance and up to the modern times is always imitative. And the closer you can come to nature, the more the art is appreciated. Okay? But icons are not imitative in that sense. Right? So the goal is to capture the divine. Before a new icon is executed, that doesn't mean painting the copies. It means if they're coming out with a new icon, as much time is spent in study, prayer, meditation, study on the subject, who it is, what it is, and that's it. Okay. Now, an icon is meant to be a window into the spiritual world, and never an object of worship. A lot of people think, oh, Catholics and Orthodox worship icons. No, they don't. It's a window, and a believer meditates on the person's, on the portrait, whose portrait is on the icon. In this way, an icon can play a role in enhancing the spiritual life of the believer. And let's take a time out here and think of every time you open up your computer screen and you see those icons on the screen. Right? Well, those icons are images of the program. It's not the program. But when you click it on, what happens? The window opens and you have the reality, right? Well, that's the icon. The religious icon is you look, it's an image of a person. But when you go into the window, and you present yourself, anyway, in your heart and mind, and you see an icon of Christ in your heart and mind. It's really Christ you're praying to, not the icon. And that whole concept of windows and icons and computers is taken from this concept right here that goes back to antiquity. Okay, so the icon is not a piece of art, but it's an aid to worship. It's an instrument for the transmission of Christian tradition and faith. Icons are devotional, and in the Eastern rites and the Orthodox Church, it's part of the liturgy. Now they put it in some cases. Okay. So the first icon we're going to look at is called the Mendelion. You can copy that down and Google it, and Google images. You'll get maybe hundreds of images of the. And it's literally translated as the holy napkin, and it is also associated with that expression "made without hands." Right? It is said not only to have been an authentic likeness of Christ, but one in which Christ himself willingly produced. It was often cited as proof of the reality of Christ's incarnation, which we mentioned earlier, as it had been in contact with his body, as a justification for the believer's position, right? And position that Christ himself endorsed the making of this image. So this story has been conflated with Veronica's veil. In the Eastern Church, they call it the Mandylion, and I'll explain where that came from. And in the West, we believe Veronica's veil, right? When Christ fell down for the second time on the way to Calvary, Veronica came up and offered her veil and created the image, right? The word Veronica herself is not really a name and by itself. It's just two Latin words coming from the Greek, vera and icon. It means true image. Veronica, true image. Okay. Now, the Mandylion goes back to the time of Christ. There was a king named King Abgar, A-B-G-A-R, and King Abgar was the king of Edessa in Syria. And Syria, go ahead on to the next one. Syria, during the time of Christ, if we refer, here's something you can make a note of. Matthew chapter 4, verse 24, we see that all over Syria, it says in Matthew's gospel, all over Syria, people knew of Christ healing the blind, giving sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf, and bringing healing paraplegics. He was a king who had leprosy. He sent a letter to Christ according to the tradition, and Christ sent an image of himself. That's what's believed. That's the icon tradition. It is that Mandylion that all the images of Christ are copies of. Okay. By the way, the first mention of that story is in Eusebius's History of the Church. He doesn't verify it. He just says that he saw the letter, a copy of the letter that Abgar sent to Christ, and then described the tradition. So it's the tradition. This is just one of many images of the Mandylion. And we see this some Greek characters around there. If you Google that again, you'll get hundreds of images, but they'll all be very similar. And all the icons of Christ are based on this. Okay. So, icons, by the way, are not three-dimensional. They're just two-dimensional frontal plane. And the icon is not a representation of the conscious world, but an attempt to suggest the beauty of Christ. I think we covered that. The first icon we're going to look at is the Pantocrator, meaning the Almighty. Jesus the Almighty. Go ahead. This one I selected because I think you're all familiar with it, right? We have this banner that's hung before, up on the altar several times a year. This is a very famous. This one now is a copy of the Mandylion. But this particular icon is one of the oldest. It goes back anywhere from 1,500 to 1,700 years ago. It's in the monastery of St. Catherine's in the Sinai Peninsula. So it's 1,700, let's say, years old. It's kind of worn out. So we're gonna look at this though because there's certain characteristics in the Pantocrator that each copy follows. So I have a more modern one on this photo here, this frame. Okay, this is a more modern Pantocrator, and we see a couple things here that we point out that they all have. You see initials up here, and what these initials in Greek stand for Jesus and Christ. That's the first and last letters of the name Jesus, Jesus, right? Jesus in Greek. That's the iota sigma, and here we have Christos, chi sigma. We also always have the halo and the three arms of the cross, because the fourth we can't see. That's for the Trinity. There's also three Greek letters here, Omicron, Omega, and Nu. And what they stand for is He who is, which is a take on Genesis when Moses asked God, what is your name? And he said, I am who am. All right, Jesus is who is. And that's what those Greek letters symbolize. He always carries, in this rendition, the Pantocrator, the Bible, you could see the cross, so it tells us it's the New Testament. And his hand is always in this configuration, or very similar. And what this are the Greek letters that are written up here. Iota, right, and the sigma, and the chi, and the sigma. Iota, sigma, chi, sigma, up there. Okay, now go on to the next one. I go back to this one because there's a lot of mention about the difference in Christ's eyes. Right? So some scholars say this is one eye represents Christ's divinity and one eye represents his humanity. Okay. And some scholars say it was a mistake of the artist. So I leave that up to you to take whatever interpretation you want. Okay. But you see, but go back. Can you go back to that again? Just quickly. Okay. You see, Christ's hands are in that similar, right? It's always in that, and he always has the Gospels there. Okay, we can go on. All right, we're going to look now at the Theotokos. Theotokos literally means God-bearer, but it's interpreted as Mother of God. Right? The tradition ascribes to St. Luke the Evangelist a painting of Mary and the Christ child. Luke was always thought to have been a physician and a painter. By the way, I selected the Theotokos for several reasons. I know Father Tom had a lecture on the Theotokos, and that controversy came out about the Nestorian heresy. Nestor was a bishop of Constantinople who said that the natures in Christ, his divine nature and his human nature, were separate, and that Mary was the mother of Christ. So she was the Christotokos, not the Theotokos, the mother of Christ, not the mother of God. But the church declared that a heresy and say that the nature, Christ's divine nature, and his human nature are in a hypostatic union, inseparable, so that Mary then, Christ is God, Mary's the mother of Christ, and she's the mother of God. So it's the Theotokos. Okay. And the first Theotokos is painted by Luke. Now you can say that's not miraculous, but Luke, remember, is the inspired author of the third gospel. And Luke is the inspired author of the Acts of the Apostle. And Luke is the inspired author of the Theotokos. Okay, next one. Well, here is the Theotokos. It's the mother and the Christ child. We're going to look at some. They believe this one, not that one, because they don't know where. There's a lot of controversy on the original. They don't know the originals. The icons we have today are copies, and there's a concerted effort to copy all those characteristics that are in the original. Okay, so this is the Theotokos. I'm going to show you a couple more Theotokos. Okay. All right, this is not an icon. I just wanted to show this painting. This is a Renaissance painting of Luke painting the Blessed Mother to show that that's a strong tradition, that he was a physician and a painter. And there are several other renditions by other artists during this period of Luke painting of the Blessed Mother. And they're wearing the dress of that particular era. It's by Roger van der Weyden, and it's 1453, and it has perspective and things like that, which we'll talk about next lesson. Okay, because I want to stick on with the icon. Here's a very important icon. This is the Salus Populi Romani, which means the salvation of the Roman people. Now this was brought to Rome in 590, so it was created sometime before that, right? So it goes back 1,600 years, but it's also attributed to St. Luke. And this is the one that's in Rome. This was brought to the dedication of St. Mary Major in Rome, because that's the only basilica that's dedicated to the Blessed Mother. So it's in Santa Maria Maggiore, right? I know Barbara was there. I don't know if Barbara saw this icon. It's in the Borghese Chapel there in that thing. Okay. This is a different version. This is a Russian copy of an original, supposedly by St. Luke also. And this one is a little different. You see, Mary doesn't have a hand on the infant. She's pointing to him. And this is known as a, I'm going to try to pronounce this Greek word here, hadegetria, which means she who shows the way, or a lady of the way, pointing to Christ. This is the way. But there's a Theotokos, right, and attributed to Luke. Okay. And this is the last one. I picked this because this one you have a good chance of seeing. It's in the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's a Theotokos, but it's painted in Italy in the 13th century, actually in 1230, by Berlinghiero di Lucca. And it does demonstrate for us how medieval Italian art was heavily influenced by the Byzantine being the Greek, the iconic tradition. So we're going to end there because I know we're running close on time and open up for questions on this on these topics. You had a question.
You were saying that that the paintings were used to help the illiterate or the poor people to understand the Bible. How do they understand the painting if they don't understand the story behind it?
Well, the stories behind them are what was preached from the pulpit and the readings. So when they were in church and they were listening to the Gospels and the readings, and then perhaps the sermons, and then they had all the stained glass windows, for example, in Northern Europe, and in Italy they had all of the frescoes on the wall. So they can associate from the hearing, and then because most of the people, even if they weren't illiterate, books weren't available, right? Medieval
You're talking
time.
about the good and evil, the good government and bad government, and then there was the paintings above the painting, the painting below the painting, and how would they understand all of that being put together?
Well, that was set up not for the common people. The ruling of the nine were selected from the aristocracy. The aristocracy in the Middle Ages, they were the ones that were invested. The poor people weren't invested in the ruling, right? These were the people who put out the money that built the buildings and commissioned the artworks and all. And as a matter of fact, the ruling of nine only were in session for 2 months, and then they were switched out for another 9 to prevent corruption. So those 9 were selected from the aristocracy. So it was to let the aristocracy know, the effects of good government and bad government. It was a reminder, like a lesson. That's good questions. I have to. My hearing's not good, so I move close.
Okay. The stained glass windows. I was raised in churches up in New York City where they had many large stained glass windows, which
Yeah.
were like icons.
Yeah.
Did they come into existence after the icons were put into?
Oh yeah, yeah. The stained glass windows, right, are in the tradition of the cathedrals in Northern Europe, right? Italy wasn't big on cathedrals except for in Milan, and the whole idea of that Gothic architecture with the pointed arch and the flying buttresses allowed them to create taller buildings and allowed them to put more windows in it. In the Italian Romanesque days, they couldn't build that high because they were using a rounded arch, and the windows were smaller. See, so to bring the light in, and there's a whole tradition about stained glass windows. We could spend a whole session on that. You see,
Thank you.
okay. That's a good question. Now, Father Tom, yeah,
Say something about the difference of the colors. The colors.
yeah.
And you mentioned something about the difference in the colors between red and blue, especially.
Well, I don't.
Is there any significance to the
Oh, well, there is, Father, but I don't. I can't tell you right offhand. Do you know about it? Of you?
I think that normally it's that red is a sign of the divinity, and that blue is a sign of the humanity, which is why Christ will almost always.
And Mary's in blue,
Yeah,
but she
Mary.
usually, a lot, in some paintings, she has like red underneath, and there's a significance to that, and I can't remember.
Yeah.
I have another question, not just the color, but in the first icon that you showed us, Jesus is facing off to the left, and all the rest of them, he's looking inward. And there's a significance, but I don't remember what it is.
I
But
don't
there
have
is
the answer to
something
that.
significant about why.
About how he's facing.
Yes, his
Yeah.
head's turned, and I don't
Yeah.
remember what.
Do you know about that, Irene?
I'm an iconographer,
Oh,
Oh,
so-
really?
and I know the colors. There are certain colors that are attributed to certain saints, and that's how you recognize them sometimes.
Yes. I have read something about that and about on the Pantocrator, the red and the greens, but I don't know the significance. I mean, people interpreted the red as this Christ's blood, and they come out with all those things that I'm sure was included in that tradition. Yeah. Any
So if Luke was a painter, are any of his artworks still around, or?
Well, the tradition says he was a painter, and the only paintings the tradition says is that he painted was a Theotokos.
So that would be his since he's seen Christ and he painted Christ, that's what we can assume that Christ may have looked like?
Yeah, well, he's attributed to painting the Blessed Mother. The portraits of the paintings of Christ were supposedly made miraculously, either Veronica's veil or the Mendilion, which was Christ sent to. As a matter of fact, the tradition says that Abgar was suffering in Syria, there in Edessa, which today is in Turkey, was suffering from leprosy, and he heard about Christ's miracles, which if you go to Matthew 4:24, you'll see that that quote is there about how that spread out through Syria. And at that time, supposedly, he wrote a letter asking Christ to come up and heal him. And he sent the letter with a diplomat, and the diplomat was also turned to paint the picture of Christ, an image of Christ. And supposedly the tradition said Christ, through some water, washed his face, and then took a towel, dried it, and there was the image. And he presented it to the diplomat, who brought it back to King Abgar, and it healed him of his leprosy. Now, the letter supposedly he wrote was found by Eusebius in Edessa, but Eusebius doesn't verify that this is a true story. But he said, I did find the letter. So it's tradition. And by the way, the Mendilion, there were they thought three originals. The one was taken back by the Crusaders, Louis IX, to Paris, and was lost during the French Revolution. There's one in the Vatican, and there's one in Genoa. The one in the Vatican, they now say is a copy of the one from Genoa, and the one from Genoa was probably made about the 14th or 15th century. So it can't be verified.
I have a question. I'm not very familiar with a lot of this. On this particular painting, and it's a little different maybe, is the lettering. There's is that an HP and an OV?
Well,
is that the significance?
You mean up here?
No.
And
Oh,
I
here?
was also going to ask about the markings on her clothing, if there's any significance, or is that just there?
So you're
At
talking
the
about
top?
the lettering of the
Yeah,
top,
at the
top left.
Over here, you mean?
No, up.
Up here.
Yeah, right in here.
Yeah.
On the other side.
Oh, yeah. They're Greek letters. I can't make out this. This would be a key row, maybe. Maybe it doesn't look like a key to me, but it could be the key row, right? Which is Christ. The first, right, keys, the CH and row. That's also a Christian symbol from antiquity. The key row, they call it. And this here is like an Omicron. It looks like a nu there, you know.
What was that?
I'm not sure.
Identification of the icon.
Yeah.
Who the person is.
I'm not sure what they are. Maybe this is alpha row. Maybe I don't know. I don't know.
The difference in lettering is
Yeah.
language?
It is though.
Okay.
Yeah. They are Greek, right? But this was made this was painted by an Italian, so I guess he had copied it. They're all copies. By the way, I'll take the opportunity to say, and I think I mentioned it next week when we get into Aristotle's influence on St. Thomas Aquinas, we're going to go into a whole new philosophical sense that's going to change the medieval time. And actually, it's bringing us to the modern times. And I'll point out one thing. Is there a chance we go back to the School of Athens? I just want to point out one thing, because we're going to talk more about the School of Athens, the first painting we had up. We're going to talk about that next week in a little more detail. All the way to the top.
And the book's The City of God, that's in multiple volumes, isn't it?
The first one. Good more.
Almost.
Keep going back.
Yeah, no, that's good. Okay. All right. The focal point on this are Plato and Aristotle. And Plato we have, like I say, next week we'll go into it in more detail. He's pointing up to the metaphysical world. And he has one of his works called Timaeus, which pretty much explains a lot about the creation of that world. And Aristotle has his hand down. He has his hand down like this, the earth, right? Because he has a metaphysics, right? He was a student. There's a metaphysical aspect to Aristotle, but He's very earthly in the sense of, physics and all, and he has his ethics, right? Human behavior, ethics, right on the earth. He's grounded on the earth. Reason, okay? So we have the dichotomy right here. This painting can be divided in half. We have Platonists on this side, or those whose philosophy or teachings were about it, and over here we have Aristotle, and these would be ones who follow, not follow his school, but have similar views, okay, earthly. So we'll see all of that there, okay. We'll talk about that in more detail, but we'll see a difference. So we'll see the progression, right, of this salvation plan in history, reflected in artwork, in philosophy, and religion, faith. Philosophy, faith, and the arts. Okay.
Now the book, The City of God, that's multiple volumes of a book.
Well, I'm sorry?
The book, The City of God?
Yeah.
That's like 4 volumes of books?
Well, it's 24. It's 24 books. The books were like large chapters, which were books. It's 24 chapters, anywhere from, depending on the translation, from 600 to 1,000 words. It's tough reading too, because it's all translated from Latin and it's written in a different context. You have to understand Roman history. There's a lot of it, and the contemporary, right? He was writing for contemporaries. Oh, good. Okay. Anything else?
A question.
Yeah.
And forgive me because I'm not at all
Yeah.
versed in any of this. Raphael, is he the same, the artist that did this, is he the same one that has done the different things in?
This picture is in the Vatican in the 5 rooms of Raphael. He was painting this at the same time Michelangelo was painting the Sistine Chapel, which is only a few meters away from this room. There's 5 rooms. If you've been to the Sistine Chapel, you've walked past this painting here. Okay, this is and the Pope who commissioned it was the same one who commissioned Michelangelo. At the same time, they were building the new St. Peter's. They were raising the St. Peter's that Constantine built, and they were building the present one today, the Pope Julius II. This was the room, this was his study. Okay. And this is Raphael. By the way, Raphael is right here looking at us. A lot of these, the painters put in the medieval and the Renaissance, they put themselves right in the painting. Yeah, that was a way of signing it. That's my face looking out at you. You see. Okay. We got some other characters in here. I don't want to get into it now, but we're going to be looking at this person over here. His name is Averroes. He's an Islamic theologian and philosopher who played a part in Western civilization and Aristotelian philosophy. We're going to talk about him next week and look at some paintings, other paintings with Averroes in it. His real name is, that's the name the Europeans gave. His name is Ibn Rushd, his Arabic name.
Is
So.
Pythagoras in that one too, or is there another painting?
Which one?
I think Pythagoras is in there too.
Pythagoras.
Pythagoras.
Oh, yeah, Pythagoras is over here.
Yeah.
Pythagoras is here. And some of them have faces of contemporaries, right? This is Heraclitus. That's a face of Michelangelo. Michelangelo. And the face of Plato is Da Vinci. So there's a lot of things in this art. We're not going to get into all of those things. We're going to just talk about some of the people, and we'll see how that played a part. Okay.